So I can appreciate what Anupam was saying about um, the earthquake that Modi launched with demonetization policy last week. I thought I will share some thoughts on um, how I see the conflict and convergence in the wireless space with respect to not only the access layer but also applications and services layer. And so I wanted to share some of my perspective as well as some of the work that I've been doing with various companies as well as the governments and regulators around the globe. Um, so I want to talk about a couple of things. One is connected intelligence, which attempts at explaining where we are going, and fourth way, which explains how are we going to get there. Uh, I believe that connected intelligence is probably the single biggest opportunity in our lifetime, given the impact it's likely to have over the next 20, 30 years. Um, and if you look at what connected intelligence means, essentially it works something like a brain where you have a number of sensors that work like neurons, informing the economies, informing industries, individuals, and so on and so forth, that help really create a global brain of information. And if you look at the technology curves, this chart summarizes the progress of the last 200, 300 years in the technology space. But the most interesting stuff really took place in the last 30, 40, which goes to show that every 30, 40 years, there is a sea change in technology that helps define the next 30, 40 years. And I believe that we are on the cusp of, or the next generation or next curve has already started, which I call the connected intelligence. And this has been long studied as by economists as long waves, meaning every 30, 40 years you see a new cycle of technology evolution. And as such, you see that various curves have come in the past 300 so years, and built upon telecom and internet, we are likely to see connected intelligence taking shape. And what happens every time a new wave comes in, whether it's industrial revolution, steam engine, and so on and so forth, you see GDP growth of a multiplier effect um, taking place. And so generally it's 2 to 3x, I believe, that connected intelligence will yield close to 5x growth in GDP. Others have talked about it in terms of Industrial 4.0 and so on and so forth. But the notion is same that because of connectivity and because of intelligence, the fundamental way we do business gets impacted and gets changed. Like any other technology era, the next generation of technologies, the basic aim is the same, that you gain more efficiency by reducing the time to accomplish that given task. And even with connected intelligence, the notion is not new. It's we are just building upon what we known for last 200 years, which is from telemetry to M2M to IoT, and going forward, going into connected intelligence, which much more autonomous intelligence uh, versus very rules-based intelligence that we have today. And as such, we see that even with IoT, you already have a handful of companies generating $1 billion or more in revenue from IoT. If you compare IoT revenues in the US from service providers, you already see that IoT revenues are very similar, is on the same growth curve as the mobile data curve we had about a decade ago. And as such, when you have these billions of sensors connected, you have yottabytes of data coming out of these sensors, you truly get a sense of connected intelligence, which transforms and informs the global economy. It's helpful to take a look at the dimension of growth across different touch points. In 2007, the U.S. data traffic was close to 5 terabytes a year. This year, we're going to do 8.3 million terabytes a year. If you look at other data points, the digital information continues to explode, going from 7 zettabytes to 252 in 10 years. Mobile data traffic doubling, almost doubling every year, going 10x in 5 years, and then from 2020, 5x again. Wearables sold reaching a billion wearables sold in 10 years. Connected devices, similarly, 40 to 50 billion by end of 2025. Data revenues have been a great story for the wireless industry, and I believe it will continue to grow at a good pace, reaching close to 1.72 trillion dollars in 10 years. Um, but even I think more interesting is what I call the fourth wave revenues. They're going to exceed the access revenues or the mobile data revenues in 10 years. In fact, they will probably exceed in the next 5 years. I'll get into what fourth wave means in a little bit. And so the mobile industry revenues will grow from 2.2 last year to close to 5.5 in 10 years. It's also helpful to take a look at consumer spending trends as to what consumers actually pay for. So you see that access is pretty consistent in terms of what US households are paying on an annual basis. But some of the new categories like devices, content storage, and software are also inching up. If you further dissect that data, you see that mobile data is kind of the number one household spend, or what I call the IT spend for US consumers. Number of other areas that used to dominate, like landline voice or even mobile voice, they are catering. Pay TV might have hit a peak and is starting to decline with OTT video rising up. More spend in smartphones, feature phone almost gone. Computers are also kind of declining. A lot of the computing now takes place on handheld devices, tablets, or smartphones. And so, what's likely to happen in the next 20, 30 years is a lot of the household spend in categories like transportation, food, insurance, and so on and so forth is likely to move to the IT layer, meaning you come up with software and services that impact all these layers, and that spend becomes part of the IT spend. And you already see that with healthcare, you see that with Uber in transportation, entertainment on these devices, and so on and so forth. So, what are the building blocks for connected intelligence? I think of it as you have number of sensors at the bottom. You have connectivity layer, fixed or wireless. You have the intelligence layer, the data and trust layer, which is security and privacy, and then you have the industries. And different entities, different companies play a role in one or more of these layers or building blocks. And so if you look at the connectivity layer, it has been central to the wireless industry. And so number of operators generating $1 billion or more continues to rise every year, reaching close to 60 um, mobile operators around the world generating $1 billion or more. And now we have operators generating $50 billion or more in mobile data revenue. So clearly data has been the growth story of the industry. And if you look on a consumption basis, the amount of consumption on a per capita basis continues to rise. In the US, close to 5 uh, gigabyte per sub per month. And you see other countries doing well as well. And so there's huge demand for consumption. It has also led to new business models that were not available before, especially like with T-Mobile using Binge On to create new revenue streams, as well as disrupting the market in fundamentally different ways. Wi-Fi, as you're well aware, plays a significantly important role as we go forward with um, new models getting introduced as well, not only just for data, but voice, entertainment, and so on and so forth, and Wi-Fi only or Wi-Fi first operators starting to surface in various parts of the world. Data traffic is still growing pretty rapidly. It's not growing as fast as it was maybe 3, 4 years ago in the US, but still close to 60, 70% year-over-year growth. And that impacts how we see CapEx and OpEx in the market. So US CapEx for LTE has peaked and is on its way down, mainly because most of the companies have built out their networks, and 5G is starting to take off in terms of new investment. But there's one worrying trend that everybody has to contend with, and that's the declining margins in mobile data. And so if you see the curves in the US, while the cost dropped, so did the revenue, and the margins are getting thinner and thinner. And as such, as we think about 5G, as we think about connectivity for the next 10, 20 years, one has to contend with what's the cost model going to be for connectivity. And clearly, Wi-Fi, fixed, all play a role, unlicensed, all play a role in making sure that the cost is reasonable as we get into gigabyte per day kind of consumption modes by end of the decade. Another interesting aspect of new generation of technologies is that as we go from 1G to 2G to 3G, typically the whole industry makes 3x the previous generation. And so in the US, that trend has stayed true. And with 4G, we are probably roughly 3 to 4x. And with 5G, given the number of players who are going to enter the market, we are likely to see a 5x increase compared to 4G. But if you look at the capex and opex models for various generations, um, it might be there's some warning signs, meaning that every generation um, shows that there's an increase in capex and opex on a per year basis. And if we continue that path, 5G is likely to have the same effect, which might be not sustainable for the US market or for other markets as well. And so we need to look at different models to be able to support next generation connectivity. And as such, I would um, propose that the cost element becomes the most important factor in transfer of bits. And so engineers have focused over times a lot on bits per uh, second, per hertz, per area, per energy component, and I would add the cost component at the end. And depending on the cost structure, the policy of how a bit gets delivered from point A to point B gets decided. Um, so I want to talk about a bit about what we can learn from 4G before I discuss a bit about 5G. So if you look at what happened between 2G to 4G, you see that there are four major markets: Western Europe, Japan, US, and China. So clearly, 3G, as you, Western Europe dominated 2G with GSM, and Japan at the bottom is coming up with 3G and starts to dominate the market when 2G was coming down for Western Europe. And so 3G, pretty much Japan, because of Docomo and SoftBank and KDDI, dominated 3G. At the same time, US was starting at the bottom with its 4G deployments. And you see that US and Japan, and US is a bit ahead in terms of penetration and usage, starts to dominate the 4G landscape, while Western Europe and other parts stayed behind. And by the end of the decade, I believe that US will be ahead of most major markets in terms of usage, in terms of how many consumers are using LTE, and so on and so forth. And there will be a significant gap between Western Europe um, and the US and Japan, as well as China and the US. The other aspect to keep in mind with respect to 4G is how we underestimated 4G. And so if you look at um, the forecast up until 2013, they were tracking pretty similarly, like what the forecast was and what the actual numbers were. But in 2013, the actual market took off, and while the forecasts were here. So there was a 160% difference between what we had forecasted and what actually happened. And so it goes to show that even the best forecast, if the companies are not prepared for what may or may not happen, in terms of how fast something comes along, how disruptive it might be, then you could be left behind. Typically, you have 2 to 3 years before you can respond to a trend, and if you are not ready to respond within that 2 3 year time frame, you're likely to be left behind. As an example, um, uh, when LTE was starting in the US market, around it was really taking off, reaching 50% penetration by 2012. Around that time, that's when the video advertising, mobile video advertising, was taking off, and Facebook and Google took advantage of that. And there's a very tight correlation between data usage and mobile video advertising revenues. And as the data access consumption grew, so did the video revenues. And not everybody was ready for that drastic change. And as such, in the segment of video advertising revenues, pretty much Facebook and Google cleaned up the clock for most of the market. So which brings me to fourth wave. So the notion is that, I've written a number of papers on the subject if you're interested. But the basic notion is that in wireless or in any other market, you have different cycles and these cycles come in waves. And so in the wireless space, we had three major buckets of revenue: voice, messaging, and data. And when the penetration reaches 70 to 90%, typically the revenue curve peaks and you start the decline, and it repeats itself irrespective of the region. And so hence the notion of the fourth wave, that if the first three waves are going to peak and come down, what's the industry going to invest in next? And so I termed that as fourth wave, and it's a more complicated wave than the previous three waves, primarily because there are a number of other entities who have entered the market. It used to be primarily operator driven. Now it's the ecosystem much broader. So the initial hypothesis for the fourth wave was that access and net revenues will grow, but will start to plateau and decline unless investments fourth wave take place. And the fourth wave will be bigger than the previous three waves combined, and the value will move up from access to the service layer. So let's see how it has panned out. A number of operators around the globe embraced the fourth wave concept, from AT&T, China Mobile, Sprint, and so on and so forth. A number of vendors have talked about fourth wave as well, Ericsson and Oracle. I've had an opportunity to serve Telefonica on its advisory board, and you could see that their focus on digital has yielded benefits with close to 5 billion in revenues from fourth wave services. I've done work in Bhutan with the government and UN and ITU, and they are focused on different types of services like education, agriculture, and so on and so forth. I've been doing some work with the Pacific Islands, and there the goals are kind of similar in terms of emergency management, financial services, and healthcare. And so if you see how the fourth waves have been holding up, you see that the voice revenues peaked and declined. Same thing for messaging. Access continues to grow in most markets, if not all. Access revenue started to flatten or even decline because of the last economic cycle, but they have started to pick up in most markets. And so the question is, do these curves come back after decline? And most times they don't. The only time they come back is if there is some intervention, either the economy really improves or regulators intervene. And if you look at financials of various operators around the world, you see that there's a lot of negatives from year to year growth, and which leads to believe that they cannot really rely on traditional revenue curves. As such, you have seen a lot of investments from different operators in digital services. In 2014, fourth wave revenues exceeded access revenues. In 2015, fourth wave revenue exceeded all the first three curves revenues. And in 2016, we'll go even further. And then globally, we're likely to see that happen by 2020. And so as such, you see that operators will get divided will segment themselves depending on investment as well as market conditions, that few will be at the top and most of them will play at the utility layer, and maybe some will be in the middle. And you see that taking shape in the marketplace with likes of Docomo, China Mobile, Verizon doing well, Safaricom. But it's the non-operator segment that's really exploding. Um, I'm out of time. I'll just cover this and then end. Um, so if you look at 2010, there were only 4 players generating $1 billion or more in digital revenues, and see how that changes. 35, 62, and this year we are likely to see 77. And so then more number of players who are entering the ecosystem and generating tremendous amount of money. So with that, I'll end and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, could we put up the questions? I know there are some. It would be great for us to take a couple of questions. Here we go, a few questions. When you mentioned 5 gigabits of mobile data per month in the US, is that on cellular, Wi-Fi combined? Is that by user or household?
Yeah, that's cellular only on a per capita basis, so per user.
Terrific. Second one, what is the role of Wi-Fi for 5G in your view?
So it can go different directions. There's a lot of discussion around use of LTE in unlicensed, and a lot will depend on the cost structures of small cells, LTE small cells. And so if you get LTE small cells to the price point of access points, things could drastically change. They might not be, Wi-Fi's role might diminish. On the other hand, if the cost curves don't collide, then Wi-Fi continues to play a significant role because of the cost issues of access.
Terrific. We have another quick question as well, that short one at the bottom. Will video be the principal driver in your views,
Yes.
Phil?
Yes, 90%.
Yeah. Okay, as the person was so kind to ask the question, we will say where it sits in your analysis, the free Wi-Fi consumption that exists nowadays, any data points on that, consumption of Wi-Fi in coffee shops, etc. So what role is the free Wi-Fi consumption?
I think so. Free Wi-Fi plays an important role from a venue perspective. It invites the consumer to be more, that's the driver, that's a draw for a lot of consumers to go and work and consume other services. And so I think that will continue until to a point where, because there's a big disparity between cellular and Wi-Fi, and unless that gap closes, we'll continue to see that Wi-Fi's role in data access for a long time to come.
Thank you. And I think as we discussed yesterday in one of the sessions, nothing comes for free. So it's either going to be your details, your email address, something somewhere is going to be paying for your, in quotes, free cache,
yeah.
Wi-Fi.